The solution is give me more power.
To regulate all these bad actors out in the street that
When
defrauded them. Trust us.
You caused the problems in the first place. You get it?
Welcome back to the Professor Penn podcast. I'm your host, David Penn. Glad you're back with us for episode number 194, The Fed. I keep playing this short, which depicts international shipping because international trade grew for hundreds of years, but it is actually the cornerstone of what is the globalist system, and the lifeblood of the globalist system is the banking system. And what is of concern to me as an American citizen is the Federal Reserve. And I've talked about the Federal Reserve during the podcast many times over the last 193 episodes. But tonight, April 2nd, Thursday night, 7:30 p.m., we're going to do a deep dive. And I've asked an acquaintance of mine, a person that I met actually at a Federal Reserve protest, Mr. Greg Volk. Welcome to the studio.
Good to be here.
Greg is a educated man, a man of many talents, a man of many different aspects of his career. He's a Stanford graduate, which is interesting. I'm just a few years older than him, and I wowed him this morning. I was actually I had a chance to go to Stanford in 1976. I went east instead of west. I found out that he went west instead of east.
Exactly.
And I've always wondered what my life would have been like had I gone to California instead of out to the East Coast. Probably quite different.
We might not be here.
Well, who knows? Well, actually, California in the 70s, you're right. I might not be here. But it's great to have you. And just for the Professor Penn podcast community, just a short course, because I want to get right to the Fed.
Sure.
But just a little bit about who you are for me too, please.
Okay, sure. Well, I'm an old guy. I'm 64, and I did go to Stanford, started in 79, and I'm an engineer, electrical engineer in physics were the two things I studied. My master's was in something called signal processing, which I haven't used for years, but it's, anyway. I've worked in a lot of different things. I've worked in financial industries. I've worked as a mortgage broker. I've been a landlord, I've owned properties. I've done music arranging. I've done a lot in the world of barbershop quartet singing, but we don't need to get into that today. So,
I was trying to find a barbershop quartet to accompany me to my CD3 convention. Here was my thought.
Okay.
And I couldn't find a barbershop quartet because people lie about me and say that I'm a disharmonious figure in the Republican Party.
Well, I haven't heard you
Actually,
sing.
I am not. It's actually the old guard that is disharmonious.
Gotcha.
There's all these new citizens coming in. We're coming in to save the republic. That's why you're here.
Exactly.
And I tried to find a barbershop quartet because my idea was instead of me going up and talking because they only give you 3 minutes,
Right.
which is a big scam,
Sure.
I just thought I would sing with a barbershop quartet and say, this is what harmony sounds like,
There you go.
right? Anyhow, Greg has taken a lifetime, and I'm very similar to you in that there's nothing that really qualifies me to
Exactly.
do what I'm doing except a lifetime of experience. For example, what you don't know about me is I've been trading internationally since 1986. My passport looks diplomatic. I've been to China over 100 times. I've been
Wow.
in Turkey. I've been in Vietnam, Korea, Japan, Central America, as in Panama. I've been to Europe many times, Canada, Mexico. I mean,
Wow.
I've been everywhere, man. And, when you do that for business, you're forced at the level of the game that I play it to learn through the school of hard knocks
Exactly.
how this works. And I suspect PhDs who learned it out of a book. I mean, you can't learn how to fight out of a book either. So I'm just going to
Well,
turn it over to
it
you.
isn't just that, it's that the books that they teach from do not teach this stuff. You cannot take a class in, central bankology. It just doesn't exist. You can take economics, you can take all kinds of classes on how to handle money and how to manage money, but it's all paid for by these very people who don't want you to figure out their secrets, honestly. And so you have to find it out for yourself,
Okay, so
which is what I did.
are you saying that a central bank or the Federal Reserve is actually shrouded in the mystery of a secret society?
I don't wanna sound conspiratorial, and I don't really wanna go there, so I won't, but I will say this much just at the start, is that it's pretty well established and it's documentable that the central bank, the Federal Reserve, and, virtually all central banks throughout the world are privately owned, and so you have to ask who owns them. And it ain't us, because if the federal government were owned the banks, they wouldn't be in debt by definition. Somebody's creating the money. Who is it? It isn't us. It's not the government.
It's not we the people.
It's not we the people. Although
Well,
the Constitution says we're supposed to, because the Congress has the right to coin money and regulate the value thereof, but they don't do it. They've delegated that authority to other entities. Who was it? And we can get conspiratorial, but we don't need to. We only need to know that some private entity owns all of these central banks. That's all we need to know to do 99% of the discussion we're going to have today.
well, let me just say the reason that I wanted to bring you in today, and of course you and I have been in touch for we met at that Federal
Yep.
Reserve protest,
Yep.
which if you think about it, takes a little bit of courage
A little
to
bit.
show up at the Federal Reserve. Apparently, there aren't enough of us yet protesting there. They view us as molecules to be ignored.
Right.
Because unless, like 100,000 people show up, they're not going to pay any attention.
Exactly, and there should have been. If enough people understood what we're gonna be talking about today, really, really understood it, there would be 100,000, there'd be millions of people protesting the Federal Reserve System, but they say, "This is the way it's always been, so it must be okay," and they go along with their lives, and it's so horrendously awful that, people need to understand ho in what way exactly it's awful.
Well, I want to say the reason I was, before I'm going to turn it over to you, I wanted to have this discussion today because here we are on April 2nd, recording for Thursday night, April 3rd.
Mhm.
Today is what President Trump calls Liberation Day.
Yep, we start
And
collecting tariffs.
we started out with this picture of international trade, which uh, has developed since 1946 on one path towards a global economy. And President Trump has been elected for many reasons, but what he intends to do is not end this system, but modify it. And this system born of um, born of man's desire to traverse the globe, and to do that, banking really developed to bridge the gap between when something leaves port and when something gets paid for at destination.
Mhm.
It's a bridge, a timing bridge. But I wanted you on today because clearly President Trump's agenda Well, it's meeting a lot of resistance,
Sure.
i.e., the loss in Wisconsin of that Supreme Court seat yesterday.
That was bad.
And there's going to be more and more resistance. And we're seeing a lot of resistance in the Congress to President Trump's tariff initiatives. In other words, the Republican coalition is getting ready to fray, and
Mhm.
it's going to get frayed over issues related to trade, which means banking.
Mhm.
And that means that the central bank,
Mhm.
while it would seem not to have a position and is supposed to be apolitical and has a dual mandate, as I understand it, of maximum employment and a 2% inflation target, that's what we know about its mandate. We, the
Why do
people,
we have to have inflation at all?
we're going to get there.
Yes, we
But
are.
I just want to say why I'm asking Greg to come in today is it is my belief that the Fed is going to be working disharmoniously with these changes, which is going to make it very difficult for the Trump trade agenda to
Yes.
be implemented. And they have the power, along with the federal judges, to gum up everything he's doing
Mhm.
and defeat this counter revolution to essentially one world government, one world economy, one world currency.
Mhm.
And so, if he is defeated, we're heading towards one world government, one world economy, and one world currency,
Mhm.
which means we are going to lose our individual freedoms, in my opinion. That's my
It
intro.
Yep.
Please
It's
take it from here.
it's consolidation of power. That's what the one world thing is all about. So, obviously they can operate as one, which they kind of have been already. So it's just making visible what's already been out there, I guess.
Oh,
But
so what you're saying is now we're seeing a system
yes.
that's already in place.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Well, it's consolidation of power. It's like one way to put it, all the gangs get together and decide that they're going to cooperate. So maybe that's one way to think of it. Again, I don't want to get into who because I don't frankly know. I mean, I have my guesses, but that's the land that's conspiracy land, and we don't need to go there in order to talk about this stuff. Let me just I'm not there's a million different places we can go, but let me give you a quick illustration um, of how debt-based money works. Okay, what? Well, okay. Let me ask you. Okay, should it be? What is your feeling about uh, selling what you don't have?
Selling what I don't have?
If I sell you the Brooklyn Bridge, would you want to buy it?
No, that would be
Why would
financial
you not want to buy it?
because it doesn't exist.
Well,
It's
because
not
I don't
transferable.
because I don't own it.
Right.
So I can't sell you what I don't have. I can't can I loan you what I don't have? Can I loan you something that I don't even have?
Apparently we can.
Yeah, apparently we can. So what I'm talking about, there's actually three major forms of what I'm talking about. The first, and I'll get to the banking last because that's the biggest. So we're going to do the smallest one first.
Okay.
But the smallest one is still in the trillions, well into the trillions, maybe tens or hundreds of trillions. That's the small one.
Okay.
Okay, and that has to do with commodities. So if you are a farmer and you have some corn seed, and you know you're going to sell that corn next fall, but you need the money now, it's legitimate for you to go and sell corn futures. Would it not be?
Yes.
Because you own it, even though it hasn't produced yet. You still own it. Or if you're a miner and you have copper or gold or silver or something like that, and you want to you're or you have a well, an oil well, and your wealth is in the ground. So you're going to produce this, but it might take a couple years for you to be able to bring it out, and you need the money now. So it's legitimate for you to sell futures contracts for that, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's what futures was intended for, and that much of it's legitimate. But if you're sitting in a New York office and you're selling futures on pork bellies or futures on cotton or something like that. You're selling them and you don't own them, but you're going to buy them back later on. Is that legitimate?
Well, we consider it to be
We consider it legitimate. You can do it. But what is the net effect of that?
The net effect of that is the manipulation of commodity prices.
Right. What is it? Well, having more of it out there, selling more. What is it? Is it make it go up or make it go down?
Well, since I trade in currency, I think they make it go any direction they want it to go.
True, but they can make it go anywhere they want it to go because they can just sell less. Selling it means there's more out there, so the price goes down. And then selling less makes the price go up. So yes, they can manipulate it both ways. That's true. But if they weren't able to do that at all, then the price would stabilize at a much higher price. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
That's commodities. And I happen to own silver, and silver is the most manipulated commodity on the planet. It has been as long as I've owned it, and I can't wait until the short squeeze happens that we've been hearing about for decades. And the price finds its natural resting place, because they say there's 100 silver contracts to every one legitimate ounce of silver. And I think that should be illegal. That's my opinion. If you own it, if you're a farmer or a miner or oil well driller, that's legitimate. If you're sitting at an office, I think it should be illegal. It's not illegal, but I think it should be. What do you think?
How do they generate those contracts for future commodities that they don't own? How are those contracts
They just
created?
create them out of thin air. They just sell them.
So,
So it's called naked short selling.
and
And it's legal, just to be clear. It's legal, and everybody thinks it's okay. But I say it's not okay.
you're gambling.
Yeah.
You're
Well, you gotta have some pretty deep pockets to play this game, because, there's always a threat of a short squeeze and blah, 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 and so you need to be able to weather the storm. And so far, they are, the players that do this, the naked short selling, are for the most part really, really deep pockets, and they can weather those
So
storms.
short selling for the people that are not playing in this
It just
means
means
that
selling what you don't have.
but also, was that depressing the price of the
Sure, and its net effect is depressing it, but short selling less can raise the price. So yes, they can manipulate it both ways, but the manipulation should end completely. That's my opinion.
so you're to move from a slavery, drugs, and piracy model, the debt slavery part of it,
Mhm.
one of the things that you would say, we're talking about 3 issues
Yep, I haven't got to the second two yet.
of financial manipulation,
Yep.
which distort regular market dynamics,
Correct.
would be to eliminate the financialization of the commodity market.
I would say this. This is the rule. This is the simplest rule that we should follow. It should be illegal to sell or lend what you do not have, period.
That'll make number 2 and number 3 all the more poignant. Let's
Yes.
move on to number 2.
Number 2 is the stock market. Okay? So if I don't know, if the commodities market is tens of trillions, the stock market is hundreds of trillions. We're not talking about small stuff here. So bottom line, it's the same thing though. Short selling. Now they have rules, and you call it hypothecate. You borrow stock from somebody else, and then you sell that. But that's like, if you know anything about the financial game, they're really loose about it. And it's like, if the rules should simply be, if you don't own it, you can't sell it. Period. That's my
It
opinion.
seems fairly
But
straightforward.
they do it all the time, and it's trillions of dollars. And the big players think about it. Remember, what is selling more causes the price to drop, right?
Because the supply
It's
increases.
supplying. Yep. So they can literally sell stock on any company they want to and eliminate their competition. Can they not?
And they are doing it right now.
And they have
That's
done
going
it
on right now.
thousands of times, and so many times that we don't even know.
So what we're
And
really saying is the market, which is supposed to be transparent and free and fair for all market participants, is freer and fairer for certain people, and everybody else is just in there as kind of a cover story.
mhm.
Would that be an adequate way of saying it?
I'd say that. Yeah. Yeah. Now, we haven't got to number one. That I'd say the stock market is bigger than the commodities market. And the last one, which is even bigger than the stock market, orders of magnitude larger, that's money itself.
Fiat currency.
Fiat currency. Fiat currency is now, we may be talking quadrillions here. I mean, I just don't even know what the number is. It's so huge, it's just beyond. And if our attention is not to this, drawn to this issue, everything else is a side issue. That's how I feel about it. This is so immensely huge that why are we worrying about all this other junk when this is the one that we need to solve? We solve this issue, all the other issues get fixed. That's my opinion.
What you're saying is solving the financialization
Financial issue. And
of
here
markets.
it is in a nutshell. You can, what's happening is money is loaned into existence. They're loaning what they do not have into existence. So again, you cannot sell or lend what you do not have, but they're doing that, and they've been doing it legally. It's legal. I say it's unethical and immoral, but it's legal, and it shouldn't be allowed. And not only that, It's not even our own government doing it. It's private individuals doing it.
And
And
when would you say, what is the birthplace or the creation myth of this
that
kind of
the history
financialization?
goes back so far. The first is Nehemiah chapter 5. In the Bible, it says, what the wealthy people, the people were crying out that that life is too hard for us, and Nehemiah said, "I accuse you, the wealthy people, you've been charging usury." This is Nehemiah chapter 5.
I was just thinking biblical
Yeah.
when, because you said it's
So
not
it's
moral or ethical, but it's legal. And what ran through my mind immediately was you can't charge interest.
yeah.
I
Well,
mean, from a biblical
I want
perspective.
to be clear now. I want to make a distinction between if I loan you money that I have and you pay me back with interest, I'm fine with that. I'm not opposed to, or you loan, that those things are fine. But it's when I loan something to you that I don't even have. I just created, and the very act of loaning it is what creates it.
And then I
And
have to
that's
pay
what
you
I have a
back
problem
with
with.
my sweat and blood and my
Correct.
creativity, the principle that you created out of thin air.
Yep.
What a scam. We've talked about
Yes.
this. That's why we're here today.
Yes.
And I think right now on the books of the Federal Reserve is something like $10 trillion of
Yeah.
that kind of
It's so
financialization.
much larger than that if you add up all the central banks around the world. I mean, it's just it's astronomical. It's
So what the central bank does, and everybody, so when you're watching the Professor Penn podcast, and I talk about the British business model, which goes back before the British, they adopted something that was pre-existing, that they are into slavery, which was chattel slavery. Now it's become debt slavery. And my theory is that the British were the first country to
well,
outlaw slavery because they realized that it was cheaper to convince the slaves to work for themselves.
mm,
They lowered their costs.
interesting. Yeah.
So you have debt
Yeah.
slavery. We got the drug business, which is part of the business model. And then we
Sure.
got the endless war, which I call piracy,
Sure.
slavery, drugs, and piracy. So we're going to focus today
Well,
on the debt slavery part,
okay, and I just like to say that war is an enormous part of this.
this business model.
Well, okay. N there's so many different directions I can go. I'm gonna get back to that. So, what I wanna get to right now is just what is wrong with, debt-based money. And people need to understand what's wrong with it is that there will always be more debt than there is money to pay it. Let me explain. Uh, let's just imagine that we're starting over, okay? And we got this little town, okay? This little town is completely, self-contained, and there's no financial system. So I come in and I say, I'll be the banker to this financial system for this town. And I'm going to loan out $10 million to, maybe 100,000 to each of a bunch of different businessmen. And then they're going to use this money to buy things, and then that will, circulate, and that will become the money of the town. Okay? So now at the end of a year, assuming I haven't made any more new loans, how much is owed back? How much is in circulation? Let's ask that. I loaned out 10 million. How much is in circulation?
Well, how much is still in your bank? But,
Well, assuming
theoretically, you could say if it's all out, then $10
10
million
million at most.
is on the
There
street.
could be a little bit that got lost in the gutters or whatever, but yeah, mostly let's say 10 million. Okay. But let's suppose I charge interest. Doesn't matter how much. Let's say 3% or whatever percent. 3%. How much is owed back to me?
The principal plus 3%
So
annualized.
10 million plus 300,000.
Right.
So the total money to pay the debt is 10 million. The debt is 10,300,000. There's more debt than there is money to pay it. So if all the debts got paid off, there would not be enough money to pay off all the debt. That we would run out of money. We would have negative money. Do
So
you see the problem?
we're
This is
forced
it.
we're we're forced continuously then to grow the economy,
So the solution is we have to loan more money so that they can
continue to
continue to keep the scam going. So they have to. This is the whole point between debt-based money. There will never be enough money to pay off all the debts. So people who say, "Gee, I'd like to have all of our debts paid off," if everybody paid off all their debts, there would be no money. Do you realize that?
so
That's
what
people got to get that through their
so what you
understand that.
what you're saying and why I wanted you to talk about this with me today is if President Trump successfully balanced the federal budget,
We need another system, but we'll talk about that.
but if he balanced the budget and there was no need to lend the government money, what would happen?
We well, if we don't get rid of debt-based money, we would be in trouble. We have to get rid of debt-based money in order for this to make sense.
Otherwise, the debt just has to keep getting bigger.
It does.
And this goes right into modern monetary theory.
And it has nothing to do with being a good manager or being a bad manager. It's like, oh, geez, if they'd have done a better job, we wouldn't be a debt. No, that's not how this works. It's like a game of Monopoly. You know, when you're ahead and you own all the properties and you give the other guy all the money, you're gonna get it all back, right? Because that's the way it has to work. It's the same deal. It's the system. It's not mismanagement. And as much as governments are, don't get me wrong, they're corrupt in all those things, but they have to be. It's because that's the way it needs to work. It's the system itself. The debt-based money system is like the beast. It just constantly has to be fed. It will not be sustained unless there are more and more and more and more and more debtors until finally the thing blows up. I believe that's where we are right now.
At the blow-up moment.
I think so. Yes, we are. And because who's not in debt right now? All the businesses are in debt. You know, in the 50s, most businesses had no debt. That's just how things were. You know, you don't have to go back that far. And governments didn't used to be in debt, you know, until the Bank of England in 1694. I mean, that's a relatively new phenomenon. But now governments are the biggest debtors in the world, and they have to be, because without all the governments, all this debt, like I said, the money would literally disappear. The money as we know it would disappear. And that's a terrifying thing. But we have to think outside the box. What could we do that's different?
So how would if the debt was paid off?
Mm-hmm. Well, let's do micro. Let's say you got a car loan, okay?
Okay.
So I'm a bank. I loan you 10,000 or probably a lot more, 50,000 for a car today. You pay it all off in installments. You paid, you know, you eventually retired it. When you pay the principal plus interest, that money then goes out of circulation because it was created on the basis of nothing. It's literally taken back on the basis of nothing.
So if the banks can't continue to lend,
yep, we no longer
there's no money in circulation.
Bingo. That's a wild one, isn't it?
That is a wild one.
Yeah.
I want everybody.
It is so obviously true. You can look at the Federal Reserve itself. Basically, it doesn't say it in those words, but it says that.
So every time a loan is retired, unless a new loan is issued, there's no fiat currency in the system to continue the operation of our economy.
That's correct.
So the issuance of debt must proceed apace.
We need to find more and more and more and more debtors. That's why the forever wars are so important for keeping the system alive.
That's an awful
it is
diagnosis of a problem,
I'm sorry, but I'm telling you, this is the root of the problem. We fix this one, we fix them all.
Wow. That is, if I seem a little bit at a loss for words, it's because I want everybody listening and viewing this to be a little bit at a loss for words. The system demands the issuance of debt.
Yes.
Or there's no money when you go to the ATM.
Yep.
All the money goes back into the coffers of the bank.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's no money unless we move to a completely different system, like bartering, like Back to the Future.
There are solutions. We don't have to go back to the Stone Age, okay? So, cryptocurrency, forms of that can work.
Well, now, this is interesting because President Trump has started a crypto initiative.
Yep.
Actually, and you can comment on this if you know about it. Tom Emmer from CD6, the House Majority Whip, has been a strong advocate of cryptocurrency. Maybe this speaks very well for him.
Maybe. I'm kind of agnostic. I've made some money on cryptocurrency, so I'm certainly in favor of them. And there is no debt. So, how Bitcoin works, it gets mined. We actually did some Bitcoin mining. So,
well, isn't it true that it becomes a competitive means of exchange to the king's currency?
It could be. Yeah. It's definitely a better form of money than fiat currency. Absolutely. No question about it. So,
but won't it then eventually find itself in competition with the king?
Well, here's what I worry about. I'll just give you my 2 cents, and I'm not an expert on cryptocurrency, but I will say my biggest concern is if, people can create cryptocurrency out of nothing, then, there's they call them SHIT currencies. You've heard that term.
Mm-hmm.
And that's there's a million of them, right? So although there's a limit on how many Bitcoin there can be, there's no limit on how many of these other coins there can be. So do we run into the problem where people are creating something out of nothing? That
Same problem.
that's what I worry about. But the good news is even if they did create something out of nothing, at least it's not on the basis of debt. So even even if we wouldn't,
It's a step up.
it's a step up. But I'm still a little concerned about it just because
I
of
want to
that.
go back to this debt thing and stay with this because, we're going to have to talk about how do we work out of this. So we've talked about on the podcast, and I'm very aware that when the Treasury issues bonds,
Mhm.
sometimes there's a great auction, sometimes the auction's not so great, sometimes there's no buyers at all. What happens when the government needs money to fund its operations and there's no buyers for bonds issued by the government? That does happen, doesn't it?
Sure.
This now we're getting down to the real
Yeah.
root
Well,
of the problem, right?
that's when the system starts to fall apart. I mean, it can go in 1,000 different directions. I don't have a crystal ball. I thought I thought precious metals were going to go up 10 years ago, and I've been waiting for a long time. So believe me, I don't have a crystal ball on all this stuff.
But
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 yeah, you're right.
this is the financialization part of the Fed. When the Fed steps in
Hmm.
and creates money
Hmm. And
to buy
nobody
a
wants to
piece of,
buy it.
and they buy a piece of paper. So we got two scams working in interdependently.
We can do conspiracy theories all day long, where there's, reasons why, like China bought a bunch of our debt in years past, and other countries have bought our debt. I suspect there are reasons that we don't know about behind doors that are forcing them, you better buy this, or something bad will happen to you. Or if you want to have this benefit, you're the king of, some third world country. You get this great benefit yourself, as long as you
Invest in
take these
America.
loans. Yeah.
Right?
Exactly. Yep. I think that's a lot of that going on. I think that's part of what's been keeping the price of precious metals down for so long.
Is it true that the holdings of the Saudi royal family
I,
in
I don't
treasury
know.
debt is a secret?
It
I
could
have
be an
heard
awful lot.
I
Yeah.
have
I
heard
wouldn't be surprised.
that by law, because
Mhm.
all the rest of the
We have
positions.
Kissinger to thank for that. Back in the 70s, we're going all over the place here,
Well,
but
that's okay. Hey, let me tell you, my audience is used to it. But you could take the ball and run with it any
well,
direction
I
you
just
want
gonna say,
to.
so in 1971, Richard Nixon closed the gold window because the French wanted their physical gold, and we said, "No, you're not gonna get it." So they closed the gold window, and then there was danger that the dollar was gonna start exploding. So Kissinger made a deal with, the Saudis, say, "Look, we need to have oil purchased in dollars, and we'll protect you militarily." That was the deal,
To
and
this day.
to this day, and that's when we got the petrodollar. We went off the Bretton Woods systems to the petrodollar, and that's been sustainable for a while. But in effect, what it's done is it's exported dollars all over the world. So dollars are that's what's part of the reason why we don't have more inflation than we do is because dollars have been exported so much.
There's demand for
There's
dollars.
demand for dollars because Kissinger created demand for it with his protection racket, back in the 70s.
Okay, so what you're saying is that the export was the dollar,
Yes.
and those that traded in dollars were protected by the mafia called
Yep.
the United States Military
Yeah.
Industrial
I
Complex.
think most people watching your podcast probably know that. But they don't know is that the dollar itself is created on the basis of debt, and there's more debt than there is money to pay it. That doesn't change because, the money moves around.
The international system of trade that we opened the podcast with,
Mhm.
a very, very high percentage of that worldwide is actually traded in US dollars beyond the petrodollar.
Mhm.
So it's not just oil.
Mhm.
Like
Oh, yeah.
in my business, the tire business, um, it doesn't really matter what country you're in.
Mhm.
You pay your offshore suppliers in dollars. They're
Yep.
collecting dollars.
Yep.
Doesn't matter if it's Vietnam
Everybody
or
has to have
Thailand
dollars.
or if it's China or Korea. When we buy, and I said this on the last podcast because, and this will be interesting to you, I started uh, being involved in the Chinese tire business in 1993,
Okay.
which is a while ago.
Yeah.
And
Well, we're not young, neither one of us.
Well, I'm young at heart, okay? I
Me
can
too.
still touch my toes. Anyhow, the, uh the, uh
The
the
tires?
exporting of our jobs is part of this process. My point being that, in the tire business, and this is what President Trump is trying to deal with now. The tire business, the consumer tires, like you drove over, got a car or truck, came over, to only 25% of consumer tires are now manufactured here in the United States. 75% of the tires we sell on Target.com, they're imported.
Mhm.
I mean, even if it's a Goodyear,
Mhm.
which is an American-made company,
Right.
it might be made in Mexico, it could be made any place in the world. I mean, you could literally buy 4 Goodyear tires from Target, and one would be made in the United States, one might be made in Canada, one might be made in Mexico, and another one might be coming out of China,
Sure.
and they're all the same tread design and the same tire, but it's an internationalized, globalized system
Mhm.
of production, and what links all of those various disparate manufacturing platforms together is trade in US dollars.
Mhm.
Is that not the linchpin of the whole system as it exists today?
Oh,
Still the
sure.
dollar.
That's what's made the Federal Reserve sort of the king of the hill, among central banks.
Now, how does that work with our Federal Reserve being the king of the hill?
Well, you just said it, because the dollar is accepted all throughout the world, therefore they can keep issuing more and more money. They can loan more and more money into existence.
Now, are these central banks every one of them, no matter what country they are in communication and in cooperation with each other? Like, is the
Well,
central
again, we're
bank
getting into conspiracy land, and
that's a conspiracy?
well, I don't know who the owners are.
No, I'm not talking about the ownership. I'm saying the banks themselves. Do they coordinate policy?
I should think so. If I were a bank, if I were a central bank, I would, just like being if I were working for the mob, I'd want to cooperate with the other mobsters. Of course I would. I mean, it benefits everybody to do that I'm working with. So that's just to me, that's common sense. Of course they are. I can't prove it, but yeah, I think they are.
And then financial sanctions would almost be like a penalty because some central bank.
Sure.
Now we're going really into conspiracy land
Yeah.
because why
Yeah.
would you penalize someone financially? Because their financial system is really a
Well,
bank,
yeah.
but politically, a government is doing something that our government doesn't like Russia.
Yeah.
There's financial sanctions on Russia,
Right.
Iran, China,
Right.
correct?
Right.
But what that's really being penalized, since it's financial, is the bank,
Yeah.
right?
Sure.
That central bank is being limited by sanctions placed upon it by our government, but it's really on their banking system. Is that not true or false statement?
I think that's fair. Here's what I like to do. I like to, rather than go into conspiracy land and speculate on this or that, I like to go into incentive land, because incentives we can understand.
Okay, go ahead.
So let's say, for example, okay, if you're getting money from the government for doing some, helping the homeless, or you're getting money from the government to all these name something,
Feeding our children, or you talking
whatever.
about like a 501(c)(3)?
Anything. You're
Okay, go
getting
ahead.
money from the government. So
Okay.
what's your incentive? Your incentive is to have a
I wanna get as much money. Apparently, what we're finding out is I want as much of a grant as I can get.
right, but how do you get more of a grant? I
Uh, well, I'm not quite.
If you
Now we're
have a
really
big
getting into
no,
conspiracy
if
lab. You tell me where you wanna go
you
with
have a
this.
big grant, if you have a big problem.
Oh, okay, the bigger the
So,
mess, the
is
bigger
it
my
in
mess.
your interest to solve this problem?
No,
Why not?
because there'd be no reason to get the grant.
Exactly. Okay? See, so that's incentives, right? I'm not talking conspiracy at all. I'm just
Just talking
talking
about
incentives.
basic human behavior.
Human behavior, right? That's the way things work. And that's why things never get done in government, frankly, because we've created incentives that people get more money if they don't solve the problems. So why are we surprised if the problems don't get solved? Honestly, I mean, that's where it comes from. Okay, so now let's talk about the incentives of a bank. How does a bank make money?
Lending it out.
Okay, so what does a bank want more than anything else?
It wants customers to lend money.
It wants to loan more and more money into existence. And not only is that true, but as we talked about earlier, it has to, or it ceases to exist. The whole money system ceases to exist if there aren't more and more and more and more loans. So it is in a bank's now, Now we're getting slightly into conspiracy land, but again, incentives, okay? If we know for a fact that the Federal Reserve and central banks are privately owned, okay? We can assume that well, we know that they're owned by like Chase Bank and, the big banks.
So
Okay.
our Federal Reserve is owned. Our
This
Federal Reserve is owned by a consortium
a consortium of
of
big banks.
private banks.
Now the question is who owns those consortium of private banks? I assume that it's a relatively small group of people. I can't prove that, but it would make sense to me that if I had the ability to loan money into existence, why would I share that with anybody? Why wouldn't I keep that
Well,
to my little
that
group?
is a monopoly because
Why,
that
of
is
course,
the Fed is the only
right,
organization that can create
right.
money.
So it's only stands to, again, I can't prove it. I'm not talking conspiracy. I'm only talking incentives. It just stands to reason that if I had this small group, I would not share it with anybody. I would keep it to myself, and we'd have families, just like the mafia has families. That's what I would expect. I never hear about anybody saying, "Hey, I own a big part of the Federal Reserve." Do you know anybody who owns part of the Federal Reserve?
Only by conspiracy
Yeah,
implications.
exactly.
But I'll tell you, I had an interesting experience. I went to Wells Fargo, and this is kind of illustrative how when your mind gets attuned to these things. I went just this week to Wells Fargo to do a transaction, and I asked for money back, and they didn't have any $100 bills. And I said, "Wow." And I said, "That's unusual." They said, "Well, our shipment hasn't arrived.
Mm,
Like my shipment of tires hasn't arrived.
yeah, gotcha.
It's inventory."
Yeah.
That shipment to Wells, that branch,
Mhm.
is delivered by the Minneapolis Federal Reserve, correct?
Mhm.
That they have a vault, and they are distributing the inventory
Mhm.
to the banks, and the inventory is $100 bills.
Interesting.
That's their inventory.
Yeah, of course.
So then we take that inventory and we borrow it. I'm a borrower from a bank. My business has a what's called a borrowing base. We borrow based on our receivables and our inventory,
Mhm.
and there's a formula for that. And I'm constantly concerned about that because I can't run afoul of my bank.
Mhm.
So banks do from time to time take money off the street. For example, the Fed, I know, was taking $60 billion a month off the street for many, many months. There's something maybe you should talk about this because this is really the interesting part of how it all goes down. There's something called quantitative easing
Mhm.
and quantitative
Loaning
tightening.
more money.
Quantitative easing, putting money in the system.
Yep.
Why do they take the money out of the system then? Why do they tighten?
Well, because again, if you tighten, then there's not as much money to circulate, and that causes deflation and, ultimately depression and recession, and they don't want that. They want enough money to be flowing to keep people happy and keep the system going. So that's why too much quantitative easing is gonna be inflationary, and too little is gonna be cause recessions. That's where we're at. But either way, I think I made the point earlier that inflation itself is ultimately caused by the need to
Land.
lend more money and more money. So there's more of it, so it's worth less. So inflation is going to happen.
You
So
talked about President Nixon taking the dollar off the gold standard in 71.
yeah.
And he has a famous speech, we've played it on the podcast, where he said that people worry about so-called devaluation, and he goes, "I assure you, this won't happen." The dollar's lost 655% of value since 1971.
Mhm.
So if you feel like you're working harder for less,
Mhm.
uh, this is
I
the
don't know if
process.
Nixon himself understood these things. Honestly, I don't know. I don't know if Ron Paul completely does. He understands more than most people, but I don't know. He's never come right out and said, "Hey, we don't have enough. There's not enough money to pay the debt." I've never heard him say that. Much as I love Ron Paul and I voted for him, whenever I could.
So the continuous expansion of debt
Yeah,
would be inflationary,
of course. And
and that's why
it's essential and necessary. You can't have it any other way. It has to be that way.
and when do you think this started? I mean,
Well,
historically?
officially started in 1913. We're going in 16 different directions here, but I talked about Nehemiah. Then I talked about, the Medicis and the famous families in the Middle Ages. The reason that's significant is a new development happened with the development of the Holy Land. and people would, make excursions to the Holy Land, and then they were, of course, later on, they were discovering India and all these different places, and they would need to have money to buy things when they got to the new place, and they didn't wanna lug all this gold around. So they had certificates, and the bankers were there to provide these certificates that, this is as good as gold. That's where the expression came from, that they could use then that certificate to function
They
as money when they went to these foreign lands. And so that's where it really began in earnest, is in the Middle Ages, uh, for that. Loaning money was around before that, don't get me wrong, but it kind of became a big thing when man was able to finally travel
over vast
over
distances.
vast distances, yes, and
So
so
certain families or
certain families
clans or
got the
gangs.
monopoly on it. Now we can talk about, goldsmiths. A lot of them were goldsmiths, and they had a vault with a bunch of gold in it, and nobody knew exactly how much gold was in there. So, they would lend out receipts for the gold that they had. But, again, I'm talking incentives here, okay? If you're a you're a goldsmith and you know how much gold you have, but nobody else knows how much gold you have. What is the temptation to lend out a few more receipts than you actually have if nobody's going to know the difference?
And that's how this got started.
Sure it is. Well, that's how debt-based
One way
money.
that
One way, yeah. I mean, there's 1,000 different
but this
places
is
we could say that's it.
but this
yeah.
is very illustrative of
Yes.
if I have a secret,
Mm-hmm.
a secret holding,
Mm-hmm.
and people are depending on me to give out these certificates,
Yep.
I could issue more certificates than I could cover.
Yep.
And as long as everybody didn't show up at the same time,
If they all did, that was called
a run on the bank.
yes. Yeah, and that did happen occasionally, and those people got lynched when it happened, so, but it was pretty rare.
But it did happen in this country not that long ago, correct?
Well, uh, I not to my knowledge,
Well,
people
did
getting
we not
lynched
have
for
runs on the banks in
oh, yes,
19
we did have runs on the
in the
bank.
29
Yes, we
in the
did.
in the crash? And
Yes, now, well, okay, now let's we're going in so many different directions. Who caused the runs on the bank? I believe you gotta think like a banker here, okay? You want to establish a central bank, so you need to, create a crisis and then solve the
centralized
crisis, and the solution is give me more power. You get it?
to regulate all these
Yes.
bad actors out in the
Yes.
street that
When
defrauded them.
and
Trust us.
you caused the problems in the first place. You get it?
How okay.
Runs on the bank because they were bankers. They could
So they decided who was not gonna make
well,
it
that I
and who
again,
did make it.
I think we're talking incentives, not conspiracy here. I suspect that what actually happened was the big banks could drive the little banks who were also lending in the same way out of business and say, look at those awful people. We need to control them. So you need to give us more power.
And does not the Fed have regulatory power over the smaller banks?
Yes. There's a lot of details on how that goes. I don't want to get into it too much, but let me just ask you one question.
Okay.
Why does the Fed, why do we have somebody setting interest rates? Where do we give them that power to set interest rates? Why aren't they just controlled by the free market?
Well, they're technocrats that are intended
Yeah,
to regulate
because
our economy.
that's the way the system was set up.
That's the
And
centralization.
here's how it works. And a lot of people don't really understand exactly how the Federal Reserve System works. It's really ingenious. Okay, the Federal Reserve loans money to all of its banks. Okay, and a lot of these banks, I mean, they're borrow it for like hours.
Are we talking
overnight.
about when you talk about the Federal Reserve loans, but you're talking about the correspondent banks that have ownership in the Fed?
Well,
or are you
no,
talking
no,
about all of them?
banks,
All of them.
all commercial banks
Okay, all commercial banks have the power
to
to
borrow money.
overnight
And then
even,
and
let's
then they
say.
have then the commercial bank. Okay, so that's like step 1 of the money creation process. Step 2 actually takes place at the individual banks. Okay, that's what
So are
people
you
don't
saying the
understand.
money that the Fed lends out overnight, let's say, is not necessarily real money?
Well,
It's like a certificate?
no, it's real money. It creates reserves.
Okay.
Reserves are extremely important. So
Okay.
so if I come in and I deposit $100 in the bank, the bank has $100 of reserves.
Okay.
Okay, the Fed gives it also reserves. Okay, so it has a certain pool of reserves. Okay, based on its reserves, let's say it's a 10% reserve requirement, which it's less than that now, but let's say it's 10%. Then if I have $1,000 in reserves, I can loan out $10,000 in funny money. You follow me?
Yes.
Now, I don't do that directly, and this is so I don't. It doesn't quite work like that. The way it works is I loan out the 1,000. That's all I do, but then it gets put back into some other bank, which is part of the whole banking system, and then that banker can loan out money against that.
Because now that banker has more reserves.
He has more reserves. So you've kept $1,000 reserves, but so in other words, what you're doing is you're loaning out 1,000, but you're also keeping the 1,000. You follow me? So you're loaning what you don't have.
Because the
You
reserve,
say I've got it, but you didn't loan. You still have it. You're still claiming to have it, and then that 1,000 goes somewhere else. Now there's 2,000, and now somebody gets that 1,000 and loans it out. You see what I'm saying?
this is fractional.
Fractional reserve banking. So the process, technically, so if I have $1,000, I can loan out 900. That's the way it works. Okay, I have to keep 100 on. So I'm really keeping the whole 1,000, but I'm loaning out 900. That 900 gets deposited, and somebody else can loan out 90% of that, which is what 81,
And thus and
810.
so.
So it ends up being the same as 10 to 1, but it doesn't happen instantly. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me. I think it might be tough on some of our.
Yeah, it's a process. Well, believe me, they thought this through, and it works. And the point is the point where the crime happens is where I told you before. The same thing in the Middle Ages. What did the goldsmith do? He loaned out what he did not have. Right? What are the bankers doing? They're loaning it out. They're loaning out the 900, but they're keeping the 1,000. It's still in their banks. They're loaning out what they don't have. That's where the crime is happening. It's always that. That's where it takes place. And of course, the reserves in the first place coming from the Federal Reserve, that you can see how that's going to determine how much they can loan out, which is a big deal. So when
But
the
they can
interest rates,
create more reserves.
but that's why interest, yes, they can, but how much the bank has to spend to get those is going to affect how much it borrows from the bank, which is going to determine how much reserves it has, which determines how much it can loan out, which affects the money supply. Does that make sense?
Well, I think it's like everything else. If you're feeling lost in this,
Sorry.
you're supposed to feel. No, it's not. It's not how you're describing it.
Mm-hmm.
You're describing a system
Mm-hmm.
that is so foreign
Mm-hmm.
to the worldview of the
Most people
normal,
have no idea.
the
what's going
normal
on.
person. Because if I'm going to say, Greg, you come to me. Well, I had this happen with somebody. Called me up and he goes, if you're listening to me, please make a payment because I gave you real reserves. If somebody knows, if I don't, I need a favor. I said, well, what's the issue? He said, if I don't get some money, I'm going to lose my house. And I said, okay, come see me because, I do things like this.
Yeah.
And I gave him $5,000. But I didn't give him a BS story.
No, you
I
gave him money you
the
actually had.
I gave him the reserve. I gave him what I have.
Yes.
And now I'm
Yes.
waiting to pay me back.
That's perfectly fine. I got no problem with
Which
that.
I did not charge him any interest on top of it.
I never do either.
But what happens with the bank is
That's a
when I
different
go to the
story.
bank, they have a reserve. Like I'm going to buy a house. Let's make it easy numbers.
Okay.
Buying a house for $100,000.
Okay.
So I have to make a $20,000 down payment, generally speaking, about 20%, right?
Mhm.
So I put my $20,000, and that's now a reserve for the bank,
Mhm.
right?
Sort of. I mean, it's
It's going into the system.
it adds. Yes.
It's leaving my
If
pocket.
you take it out of your pocket and put it in the bank,
But it was
then you're adding
already
to the
in, but it
reserves.
already was in my bank, a reserve for my bank.
So the reserves didn't change.
So it's going from one pocket to the other pocket in the system.
So as far as the system's concerned, nothing changed.
I get a piece of paper called a mortgage contract.
Mhm.
And now they took 20 grand from one pocket to the other pocket.
Mm-hmm.
And now I am now encumbered
Yep.
with an $80,000 mortgage,
Mm-hmm.
which I have to pay 10% on a month for easy numbers. So I have
Sure.
to pay that off.
Mm-hmm. You're going to pay triple, over 30 years, easy. Maybe
Right.
Quadruple.
So they take that in, right?
Uh-huh.
And I have taken a piece of paper. I'm paying. They didn't actually give me my house.
Yeah.
Is the collateral if I don't pay.
Yes.
So the only real thing
Mm-hmm.
is my home,
Mm-hmm.
which they will be more than happy to repossess from me
Yep.
and take that into the and then resell it using my down payment as a cushion against the resale.
Mhm.
So they've issued a piece of paper against a collateral asset,
Yep.
and that's why the
If
housing
if everybody understood this, they say before morning, all the bankers in the country would be lynched. And again, I don't blame the bankers because they're doing what they're doing is legal. I'm not accusing them of doing something illegal, but it's the system is that bad.
well,
It's
I don't think I said this on, camera, but I said before maybe I said it on camera. This debt-based system is our cultural zeitgeist. I mean, we
oh yeah.
all
We can't imagine things being any different. It's just hard to we have to get so outside of the box. It's almost insurmountable.
in fact, the word
Mhm.
equity, as if these people are this smart, and I think they are. The word equity, which is my value in a business or my value in my piece of property, my value, what
Mhm.
I own,
Mhm.
has been the meaning of the words changed. It's no longer what I possess, it's about equitable outcomes for everyone. So the very word equity
Mhm.
presumes a lack of assets.
Mhm.
So these are some awfully
Yeah,
smart people we're dealing with here.
I know.
Now, I personally, not to get conspiratorial, this is just me. I don't think people are that smart. I think there are
I'm
other
kinda with you
factors.
there.
I think there are other factors here that are beyond human
Well, I think like
understanding.
you say, there are PhDs in economics who don't understand some of the things we're talking about, and it's not that they're dumb, it's that they're just it's outside of the purview, it's not what they're taught, and so and they don't it takes a certain amount of courage and a certain amount of humility to say, "I don't think that what we have is right," and then, to dig into that and to wanna know more about it, and, I don't know, it's a I don't wanna get
Well,
into
is,
the
is
personality thing,
President
but
Trump
I think he understands what we're talking about today. I believe that in my soul. But, he's up against some enormous enemies, so, and this is I'm more hopeful. I've known these things we're talking about since the '80s. And I even used to give lectures to groups that called themselves the Patriots before I got married in the '80s. And so, I mean, and most of those guys are gone now. But anyway, and I just thought this side of heaven, I'm not gonna see a change. But for the first time in my life, I'm hopeful that it might change.
well, what would be from your
Well,
perspective?
I'll give you an example. Okay, what could be a bank? Okay, so this you have to change your mindset. Now, if a bank is paying you interest, it's obviously the idea people think in their minds that, "Oh, I'm putting money in the bank, and I still have the money in the bank, and yet somehow the bank is also loaning the money out." That thinking has to change. If the bank is loaning your money out, then it no longer has your money. That's the way it should be. Doesn't that make sense?
Right.
So if you have a checking account, you should not expect interest. Now, most of mine don't pay interest. In fact, you might even have to pay a fee for the services. That to me that's the system, and that's the downside. And people might say, "Oh, I don't want to do that." Well, that's the upside is so much bigger that it pays for the downside. But now, if you have, let's say, a savings account, and you say, "Okay, bank, you can loan my money out. I want it back in 6 months," then the bank can legitimately loan your money, and not still have it. So you can't claim it back until the time is up because the money is gone. Okay? That's legitimate. I'm in favor of that. So banks can still exist. They just would function a lot differently than they do now. What they can't do and what they shouldn't be allowed to do is have the money and then also loan it out because then they're basically creating something out of nothing. And that should be illegal.
And all banks are doing that.
Commercial banks, not all banks, all commercial
Commercial
savings and
banks.
loans are not doing that.
But all commercial banks
Yes.
are taking something.
Yeah,
They're working
and they're
both ends
and
of it.
and they're good people, a lot of them. I'm not saying and they're saying, "Oh, I'm doing everything legal," but that's where we have to get outside of the box. It should not be allowed. It's not. It creates this debt based system, which should not exist. It's
Because
wrong
what does a debt-based system
because it
create?
ultimately explodes. It's not stable. I mean, we go back to all throughout history. Why did Rome fall? Rome fell because of the money, because they got accumulated more and more debt. So you were asking when did it start? It's been around through all of history. Rome fell because of debts, and they were coming up with creative ways.
Like debasing the currency.
Debasing the currency that
You
was
know,
happening then.
so the printing of more fiat currency is akin to the king taking a gold coin and then minting it
Well,
as draws.
so there's two problems. The one problem most people are aware of is the problem that, they can just keep creating it, and they think that somehow the government's doing it, which it's not, because it's in debt. And that's bad, but having a debt tied to that money that created is much worse. You understand? Because there's never enough money to pay it
Okay,
back.
slow down. Slow your roll here now, Mr. Greg. So we're $37 trillion in debt.
Yeah.
So that's good for the banking system.
It's good for us in a way. If we want this money system to continue, then we as consumers want to have more debt. We just want somebody else to be in debt, but we need more debt,
More and
or
more
we
debt.
can't have our system the way we have it.
So
That's why we need to change.
how do we change?
Well, like I said, we need to accept the fact that, hey, if I'm going to get services for banking and I want my money to be there when I come and get it, I can't expect I should expect to have to pay a fee for that.
a reversal,
Yeah.
paying for services.
Yes. And that's reasonable. And so, like, okay, that's the price I pay for a money system that isn't cheating me.
So you gave 3 examples where a piece of paper
Mm-hmm.
that represents something that doesn't exist
Mm-hmm.
is given. Let's go back and try those 3. Let's start out with commodities futures again. Maybe people will have a better handle on this time if we go over these 3 examples.
Sure.
Commodities futures was the first
Yep.
idea that if you're a
But-
farmer and you're going to farm
Mm-hmm.
beans,
Mm-hmm.
you could sell the outcome of your year's efforts because you're going to get those beans sub a disaster.
Presumably, yeah.
Right. So that is reasonable to you.
Yes.
But when a broker creates a contract
Naked short selling.
out of thin air,
Yep.
that is selling something they don't have
Correct.
and can't get.
Right.
Right?
And never intend to get. They're intending to buy it back later on
Okay.
at a lower price.
So that is a huge market that pales in comparison with number 2, which is
The stock market.
Stock
But
market.
it's the same thing. It's the same, I mean, people can drive their competitors out of business just by selling their stock short, selling what they don't have. And you can manipulate the price. You can make it go up by selling less, but that's why there's always some being sold.
Would you say that would be possibly happening to Tesla right now, for example?
Sure. Again, I don't know this, but I wouldn't, sure. That probably drives things more than anything else.
So it's a lot more the players in this game at this level
We're
of the
giving
game,
them the tools to do their dirty business.
those people know who each other are,
Yep.
and they're involved in a
And they
great
can all
game.
they can all sleep at night because they say, what I'm doing is legal.
I've heard George Soros actually say that
Sure.
on 60 Minutes.
Yeah, George Soros said, well, if it wasn't me, it'd be somebody else.
That you saw the same clip.
I know.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a totally amoral person, but it's legal,
Well, this is something that we've talked a lot about at Free People Radio, and I think Royce White has been very eloquent on what he calls the 3 heresies of the West.
Mm-hmm.
One of them being democracy,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that if 50% of the people plus 1 vote for it,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. It's now the law.
Right.
So we have a whole system of laws that might not be moral or
Mhm.
true or good,
Mm-hmm.
but it's legal.
There you go.
And that really is the problem we're talking about here, isn't it?
I think so.
So at the root of our country is a series and a set of legislation, federal legislation, that enables a system that, while it functions and it's amoral, it probably is not good. Is that what we're really saying?
I would say that. If I may, I'd like to, I know we're going all over the place, but I kind of want to make sure we get this one covered
Okay.
today. And that is getting back to incentives again. So I asked you a while ago, what do banks want most? They want to
Lend money.
lend money, and the more money, the better, right? So they need to constantly find more and more and more and more borrowers. Okay. So it started off, let's say with cars and whatever. I don't know. They probably weren't cars 100 years ago, 150 years ago, but whatever. They loan money against property and things like that. And then obviously mortgages. Mortgages are great to loan money against that. But even that wasn't enough. So they had to go for bigger fish. And then the next bigger fish, I would say, would be corporations, loaning money to corporations. So you got to create incentives to force corporations to borrow money. How do you do that? Well, again, one way to do it would be to create all kinds of nonprofit organizations that compete with corporations. So corporations have to get more money to get back in the game. And you know what I'm saying? There's a bunch of different ways to make corporations have to play bigger in order to sustain
So
themselves.
the government could borrow money.
Yes. Well, I'm getting to governments.
But I'm just saying the government is borrowing money and is funding these nonprofits.
Right.
Which
after corporations, the next biggest fish, the biggest fish, obviously is governments. So if you can get into the lending money to government game, then you're a king of you conquer the world, basically.
And I think God, I can't remember the number, but it's just crazy how much the government's an aggregate total.
Mm-hmm.
It's so much more than world
hundreds
GDP.
Of trillions, and I don't even know.
I think it's like God, I don't want to misquote it.
Quadrillions? I don't
know.
No,
but I mean, it's,
not that much.
I think, and I don't know if this is true either, but it's widely reported that no government has ever paid back a sovereign debt that exceeded 100% of GDP.
Yeah.
And our world GDP is much less than the aggregate total of all sovereign debt.
Yeah.
So that's why you're saying this system's getting ready to
explode.
It
has to, because there's no bigger lenders to get after the government, right? So where do you go? You can't find more lenders. And like we said, the system itself is not sustainable. Just like early Rome, it was not sustainable. I mean, their whole, getting back to Rome, the reason it wasn't sustainable was because they had to have a constant supply of new slaves to keep the economy rolling. It wasn't sustainable on its own. And that's how they ended up getting into debt. I don't want to get into too much of that detail.
That's the same thing.
But
now,
the point is, our system is not sustainable. It will not. It's not a question of mismanagement. It doesn't matter who gets in there. If we don't change the system, it will explode. It will fail.
Well, how do you change the system, Greg?
Well, let's get to that. I want to get to governments first.
Okay.
So I talked about corporations a little bit.
First, there's
how do you get
homes? There's businesses, and now you're king of the hill. When you indent all these governments.
If you can somehow get governments to which are supposed to be sovereign. Our Constitution was written to say that the Congress has the right to coin money and regulate the value thereof. That literally means we can create the money. And that's, believe it or not, that's what Abraham Lincoln tried to do during the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln understood the things I'm talking about. And he followed Andrew Jackson, who also fought the banks. And there's a lot of bad things people can say about Andrew Jackson, but he's one of my favorites because he fought the banks and won. He's the only president ever to do that. Lincoln also fought the banks and lost. Well, he lost. Got killed by them, in my opinion, but that's conspiracy land. But anyway, and he did issue something called greenbacks, which were United States notes, which were issued by the government. So the government was spending it into circulation, and it would then tax it out of circulation. Is there any interest involved in this?
There must have been.
No,
there wasn't.
There's no interest. Just you spend it into circulation, you tax it out of circulation. You tax out exactly what you put in. You can regulate the value thereof by doing that. I say that's legitimate.
And policy-wise, the explanation for the formation of the Fed then was that there was a great recessions, a number of them right in a row after the Civil War, because that was and I say this, I think that the changes that President Trump is trying to roll out are akin to the changes that President Lincoln tried to roll out in 1861. We're talking about changing. Well, President Lincoln was changing a slavery-based system to one of human freedom.
Right.
So he was undermining the entire concept of the political economy at that time. And his reward was a bullet in the head.
The Civil War is a good example of what I'm trying to get at. Who funded the South?
I don't know who funded the South.
Banks.
Well, some bank, but I mean, I don't know where those banks.
It's mainly
French banks,
French and English banks. Yeah. Who funded the North?
The same banks.
Yeah. That's my point. That's my point.
They
How
fund
do
bo
bankers
they
create
fund both sides of the conflict.
how do bankers get governments to borrow money?
They have to have a crisis that
A
requires
crisis or a
a war.
war. So I don't know if you've heard the expression all wars are bankers' wars, but I personally believe that's the case.
And then our government has managed to go $37 trillion in debt, and it hasn't
Well,
been
we got a forever war. We don't need to have
a big war.
A big war. We just have it going on and on.
So the United Nations Security Council regulates war
Sure.
the same way that states regulate cigarettes.
Yeah.
Cigarettes aren't good for you, but you can still buy them and pay a lot of taxes.
Right. Why do all the globalists want to keep the Ukraine funded? And keep all this money going to foreign countries, Iran and Iraq. We gave Iran all this money, under Obama. Billions, yes. Why do we do these things? You think, in a common sense world, that makes absolutely no sense. But let me get back to another issue, and that is the U.S. government is very strong. Okay, and this has been true since the 80s at least. Okay. But there's a lot of countries in the world that are not very strong, and they're headed up by some, totalitarian
despot,
desperate, right? But what do we do with those countries?
Make them indebted to us.
Well, no,
to the system.
No,
or sometimes
they don't have a lot of assets. So what we do instead is much more creative. We give them grants from the U.S. coffers. We give grants to everybody.
Are you going to explain all this USAID now?
Why do we give them grants? This is what I'm getting at. Okay, so what's come out with Elon Musk lately, and this is good, is that we've been giving grants. We've been finding out for what, basket weaving in Somalia or gay studies in Iran or something like that. All these crazy things, and everybody goes, oh, that's obviously a kickback, and that's true. There is a kickback involved, but have you heard the expression that you in order to make billions, you have to spend millions? You know what I'm saying? So you grease the palms of the politicians to get them to do what you want them to do, but that's not the big money. The kickbacks are the small money. That's the
diversion.
Potatoes.
That's the diversion.
I'm talking about the big potatoes that nobody else is talking about. Why are we giving money to all these countries? Because they're in debt and they can't pay it themselves. Why they're in debt? Because more debtors, the better.
So you're saying that, wait a second.
So who pays the interest?
Slow down. Are you saying that the system has indebted these countries, they're asset poor, they can't pay back, so then we issue more reserve, more fake, so that
is what I'm saying.
So the whole system is a house of cards, is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
So when President Trump interrupts the flow of this cash,
it's huge,
which we're paying for as taxpayers in the sense that we as individuals are the collateral. My energy is the collateral.
The IRS.
That's the collateral, right?
Yes. The ability to.
So it's not just that the Fed is issuing or creating money to buy bond paper, which is paper on paper, there's no value.
Mm-hmm.
To get this money into the system.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying this is new, and I like learning something. What you're saying, your theory is that the reason all this money is going out in foreign aid is to put money into these countries so that they can service the debt, which was also created to fuel this system, this merry-go-round,
bingo,
which is a completely constructed, non-real system for everybody except for whoever is taking in the interest on all the debt. They're actually accruing all of the real value, and if somebody doesn't pay, they take the real assets.
The resources. This has been going on since, Cecil Rhodes confiscated all the gold and silver mines, in South Africa.
They call it the Rhodes Scholarship.
Yeah.
I think Bill Clinton,
he was a high-class crook.
Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar.
Of course he was, yeah. He was
Cecil Rhodes, we had a country called Rhodesia, which is now called Zimbabwe.
Yep.
Rhodesia, where there was apartheid and Cecil Rhodes.
But it's the same thing. We basically use the debt to ultimately seize the assets we want, that they want. We don't get them. You and I don't get them. But
we're debt slaves.
We're debt slaves, exactly. And so again, I'm trying to stay away from conspiracy land here, but I'm
Well, no, it's
thinking
not. We're not talking.
we're looking. We know that we live in a debt-based system, and we know that debt-based systems escalate. They can't do anything other than that. And ultimately, all the assets. I mean, Thomas Jefferson said it. The assets are going to end up in the hands. We're going to become slaves to a bunch of foreigners. I'm destroying that quote, but you know the quote I mean.
Yeah.
And that is exactly what will happen if we allow bankers to continue to run our lives. And it isn't as though we mismanage or anything. It isn't as though the guy who works at the bank is a bad guy. It's just that the system itself has to play out that way. It can't play out any other way.
So now what you're saying is the system has been rigged
From the
to
start.
collapse.
Yes.
Okay, so
They knew that back in 1913.
Okay, so they
They knew
know
it then.
that. So then they have Plan B.
They had it all figured out, and that's where we're at, I believe, right now. And I think Trump
Is
is
trying to stop that.
changed Plan B to a different Plan B.
Okay,
That's
so
what I think is happening.
and
Yes.
so the cutting off of the money to all these NGOs and charitable organizations and universities,
That's a start.
it's all part of interrupting
Yes.
this system.
Yes.
And do you think President Trump sees it at this level?
I hope so. I don't know. He hasn't said anything that indicates that he gets it. I wish he would start educating people.
Well, this is why people want to watch the Professor Penn podcast.
I don't claim that I know, more than everybody, but I don't hear people publicly saying the things I'm saying. And I know that there's people, I know, like
But this is
Edward Griffin, he talked about the creature from Jekyll Island.
right.
And I think a lot of people have read that, but even he doesn't totally say all the things I'm
Well,
saying.
this thing you're just saying, I think, to me, is the bombshell of the night for
Okay.
me,
Okay.
which is the funding of all these organizations all over the world, the massive amounts, the billions of dollars that go out to these
Yeah.
countries, the
Yep.
foreign aid,
Yep.
actually is not foreign aid.
No.
It's the exchange of one kind of debt for another to keep this merry-go-round moving around. And we're paying for it with our taxes. And what we're doing is, and I've been saying this for 193 episodes, it's a business
I've been saying it
model.
longer than that.
Well, I only started 193 episodes ago, but I've seen this for a long time, that we're trapped on this wheel of debt. But what you're also saying is the system is rigged to implode.
Yes. They
And
knew
you're
it then, and it can't do anything else.
And I agree with you that President Trump is trying to interrupt that. And now we've reached the point where he's meeting a lot of pushback.
Sure.
As we saw, he lost in Wisconsin, allegedly. Allegedly.
Yep.
But the federal judges, of course, are now reversing his cessation of this aid,
Mhm.
demanding that this whole thing continue. Of course, they probably have no idea what they're doing
Mhm.
because they're technocrats and they're
Mhm.
focused on rule of law because it's legal.
Right.
It's not necessarily moral or right or good. And this is where we get into this moment of what's really going to happen here.
Mhm.
I can speculate with you.
I can speculate too. There's 1,000 different ways things can go. I just don't know.
Well, let's talk about a good way. Let's be hopeful. What would be a good outcome of this 4-year Trump presidency from within the context of this conversation?
I would say this, obviously anything that's owed to central banks would be null and void.
Just write it off.
Just gone.
What happens to the banking system if we do that?
Well, we start anew. We can have a new banking system like the one that I talked about, where we have just independent banks, and you can have checking accounts and savings accounts just like before. Checking account, you might have to pay a fee for the service, and savings account, you can't. If you put your money in for a year, you can't. It's literally gone for a year, but then you'll get it, hopefully back. I mean, assuming the investments that were made on your behalf were good investments, you'll get the money back.
I actually have trademarked a tagline called the Great American Jubilee.
Yeah.
The word Jubilee.
This is the year of Jubilee, I'm told.
The word
who
Jubilee. The word Jubilee is actually a biblical word.
Of course.
And every 50 years, prescribed in the Old Testament, for those of you who are anti-Semites,
debts are forgiven.
Debts are no matter the debt.
Right.
All debts are forgiven.
And I do have a little bit of a problem with that because there are legitimate debts. I mean, a lot of people invest in bonds, which are owned by corporations. And so to say that the corporation suddenly doesn't owe you money, I think would be not legitimate. I don't think that would be fair.
Do you think there's any?
Because the people that paid for that paid for it with money that they earned. So that would not be fair to say, now we don't owe you. So you have to be careful. You follow what I'm
There's
saying?
different kinds of debt.
There's different, and the same thing. Like if you or I owned federal debt, we thought it was a good investment, which I don't. But if we did, and I paid for it with my own money, I that shouldn't be erased. So it isn't as though you can erase.
So it's really down to that $10 trillion
Well,
of financialized debt on the Fed's balance sheet we're talking about.
You want my answer. This is where I do have to go into conspiracy land.
Okay, go.
Okay, but
please.
I do it on the basis of
It's all in goodwill.
well, it's all based on incentives. If I were a central banker and if I were able to institute a system like this and people were foolish enough to buy into it, which they obviously are, then I would I would have the ability to control the assets ultimately of everything. I mean, it would just keep coming to me, and it would just grow exponentially. I would become so I or my consortium would become so astronomically wealthy that it would be beyond understanding. I mean, quadrillions, who knows?
And that's probably where we're
I
at
believe that
today.
is the case.
Today.
And the people who are the wealthiest people in the world, it's not Elon Musk, it's not Bill
We don't know
Gates.
their names.
They're puppets. That's my opinion. And the real people we don't know. And is it Rothschilds? Who is it? I don't know. I don't care. I think Trump knows. And I think, let's put it this way. If I'm right, if it is a handful of families, let's just, let's pick a number. Let's say there's 100 people in the world that have control of all the financial resources. Then those 100 people should be dealt with severely. And you decide what severely means. But and their assets confiscated. And that
would be a jubilee.
Let's put it this way. The money, every dollar that's in debt is owed to somebody. Okay? So yeah, but then all of those those assets then could be used to pay off the debt, and all the legitimate debts would be paid, and the illegitimate ones, which are owned by those people, would not be paid because their assets are confiscated, and
that's why
then I think a lot of debt would just cease, because corporations wouldn't need to go into debt because they would have the funds to be able to handle it. Governments wouldn't need to be in debt. People wouldn't need to go maybe, a little bit into debt for houses. But I envision a world where, people could buy a house when they're young. I don't know.
I bet you'd
I'd like to live in that
Tanner.
world.
I bet you'd love that.
Oh man, I'd love that.
I'm just out of curiosity.
Or at least we could lend it to each other,
Let's hang on for a
Go ahead.
Okay, Tanner, we've had this kind of wide-ranging kind of stream of consciousness conversation. Some of the issues are difficult to get your mind around. What's your takeaway from what you've heard with these two older people talking in front of you? What is a 25-year-old man? What are you hearing?
You blew my mind on a lot of things. I think the example of the town, and then that was the best illustration to make me understand. I've never felt good about the Federal Reserve. Hanging around here, I just hear talk, so I'm like, okay, there's something fishy about them. But that illustration of if I loan out $10 million and it's a 3% interest, then the interest there's no money to actually cover it.
Right.
Blew my mind. So I'm learning a lot. This episode is probably one of my favorites. I've learned a lot, and you're really easy to listen to.
Well, thank you.
You make it really digestible. So
good.
Well, let's in the last few minutes, what we're summarizing here is that if the system doesn't continue as it is, it implodes.
Yes.
It always needs more borrowers.
Yeah, I think of the remember that Little Shop of Horrors? Feed me, Seymour.
Right. Okay, so war being the best,
the thing grows
because the war necessitates large transfers of borrowed money.
Yes.
Right. And we're talking.
Why do we waste so much? It's like all these things start to make sense. We're wasting because waste creates more debt. So the more waste, the better.
So President Trump is reversing this system.
Yes, I hope.
Actually, the international trade system that we showed up starting the episode with is one of the more integral aspects of this system, because on those boats are real commodities.
Mm-hmm.
So the bank is lending against at least something that's a real asset. What we're talking about is the lending of things They aren't even real.
Right. Yep.
Okay, so President Trump, what I think is going on, because today is Liberation Day. When this posts up Thursday night, we're going to know what the rollout of this tariff program really is. And what he's been saying is this is going to make the American people rich.
Mm-hmm.
And all of the pundits and purveyors of this debt-based system are saying the sky is going to fall.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Both are going to happen. Yeah, I mean, well,
because we're changing a system.
if I'm right, if I'm right, and I'm only speculating, if a lot of wealth is concentrated in the hands of a very few people, and if that money then can be confiscated, then that could fix a lot of problems really, really fast.
Would you perceive that President Trump,
I know he's got the balls to do it,
but does he? But I mean, because they're going to oppose his agenda now.
Of course.
Clearly, do you think he'll escalate then and actually start to go after this?
I don't know. I don't know his strategy. I know this has been a military operation. I'm a Q follower, so I believe it's a military operation. I believe that there are at least some people involved in this that know what's going on and are going after the right people. I don't know who the right people are. I'm only looking at incentives, and I say this is what I would do if I were running the show. And if you had this astronomical amount of wealth, it would not be hard to control all the media, control all the corporations. It wouldn't be hard, and
Well, they're not.
so it's not a surprise that they're doing that, right?
They're not controlling Free People Radio where you're
Right.
sitting today,
I
here in the
get that,
belly of the
but they
beast.
control an awful lot, and they're
Well,
trying to control.
Isn't
everything.
the growth of alternative media where
Yeah.
people can discuss this?
I
Because
agree.
this would not
But
be
unfortunately,
happening.
it's not being discussed enough, at least not to the
Well,
level we're talking about.
we got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
We're
that's
at,
it.
so you know what you can all do, and I've been thinking about this a lot, particularly in terms of Tuesday night's episode about anti-corruption, because this goes along with the theme of anti-corruption.
Right.
Because republicanism is based on not lying, like
Right.
Honest Abe, and this whole system is a lie,
Mhm.
which we the people don't really understand. We really don't have our arms around it.
Right.
We're just trying to get there. You're going to have to come back. We have to keep talking about it, because when we don't understand things, what we tend to do is ignore them.
Right.
So this goes on.
This is so important that we as a people need to educate ourselves. I've been screaming this for decades. We just need to know this stuff, and now I'm glad that Tanner know a little bit more. You can share it with your friends and just get people educated. This is not something you're ever going to learn in a university. Why? Because the same people who are promoting this system are also promoting the educational system.
They're making sure who gets hired in these
That's right.
professorships.
Just like Big Pharma funds the medical schools so they can get their drugs pushed. The big money. They're promoting. They bury this stuff.
Well, I'm gonna leave with this thought. President Trump is cast in a lot of different lights, and from the perspective of what you just said, that media is really public relations for this presumed group that might have the incentive to make his agenda fail.
Mhm.
What's going to make his agenda succeed is when people get involved in the political process. Everyday citizens, listen to what we're talking about. Even if you can't get your mind wrapped around all of it, which I'm going to tell you, I can't either. It's such a big system and it's so complex by design
Mhm.
to make it impenetrable unless someone devotes themselves to
Right.
looking at it, which you don't want to talk about conspiracy theories. You know a lot more than what you're talking about
Well,
because you're talking about incentives. All you're trying to get across tonight is that the system must implode. It's planned to implode,
Mhm.
and President Trump is trying to change. He can't stop the implosion.
Right.
He's trying to change the endpoint from plan A to Trump plan B.
Right.
And if we don't, and I say this to everybody in the Republican Party, if we don't figure this out, the neocons, the war hawks, the Republicans in name only, your children are going to be in plan A,
Yes.
which is not very
It's worse
free.
than what we have now. Yeah. We'll be slaves in a different kind of system.
Even more under control.
Mhm. They listen, again, going back to incentives, if you were able to get control of the entire world, 100 people get control of the entire world, would you give that up easily?
No.
You would create, and you knew it was going to explode. So you say, we got something else planned.
They
And
are going to
something else is a
they're
technocratic world, like you talked
they're
about.
creating a crisis, and then they're gonna show up as the saviors,
Yep.
as the people, and they actually will
And
be
they've
the
been
only,
doing this for decades. We've seen it.
and they're the only people that actually have the assets
Of course.
to actually save
They
the
can
deal,
create crisis.
because they've taken all the real assets off the street and in return given us fiat currency.
Isn't that nice?
So the scam, you know, President Trump, I am not a person who gets involved in hero worship. My interest in President Trump is the ideas
Yes.
that he is
me too.
promoting. And if you love President Trump personally, I'm not knocking it. But I'm going to tell you, we don't have his back. And the reason I know we don't have his back
As a Republican Party?
as a Republican Party is because the party is still controlled by an apparatus that is completely wound into, either by stupidity or ill intent, into this debt-based system, which President Trump is standing up alone, like a guy standing out in a gale hurricane,
I know.
trying to face this down
Yeah.
with almost no support.
Yep.
And now we're going to start seeing.
Well, I believe he does have some support that we're not seeing. You know, he talked about the military way back in 2016. And so I think that's part of it. You know, that's part of how he's able to force. It's the only way you're going to get this done, force his, you know, his will on some of these things. But also, you know, he's got more people behind him today than he did 8 years ago.
But it's not just being behind him. We got to get into the parties.
Yes.
And get these rhinos out.
Yep.
And get in American citizens that.
Well, I'd be thankful if we just get a few senators and a few congressmen in place that actually understand these things. That's why I'm hopeful with Royce.
And have the that's why you're a Royce supporter.
I'm a huge Royce supporter. I've never known anybody who actually marched to the Federal Reserve System and running for political office. It's like, that's my guy. I'll you know,
in other words,
I'll
whatever his
run through broken glass for that guy.
whatever his flat spots might be, and we all
I don't
have
care
flat
about
spots,
all of his
because he's
things I
spoken
disagree with.
the truth.
That's what I care about more than anything.
On that note, Greg, I want to say it again. Greg is a Royce White supporter at my age, and I am a Royce White supporter at my age, even though Royce does things which, you know, the Michael Broadcorps of the world post up like, you know,
I
he's
don't
got
care
a
about that stuff.
horn growing out of it. No, Royce is over the target.
You got that right.
He's over the target, and we have to support him here in Minnesota.
Yes.
Because if we had one voice in the Senate, courage is contagious.
He's got courage. I know that. I like him for that too.
It's great, isn't it?
I do.
Greg, it was great to talk with you and meet you today.
Yeah.
To everyone, I want to wish you a healthy and well-being weekend. It's always a privilege and an honor. Please repost these links. Please. We're not going to get any help from YouTube. It's your reposting on X, your reposting on Getter, that we build a community of people that will come together to free us from a debt-based slavery system.
Amen.
Have a great night. Thank you very much, Greg.
Thank you.